So as a quick review of the concept behind the mechanisms of natural selection, heritable adaptive trait that gives a group of individuals within a population that is under environmental constraints due to limited resources, leading to competition, would give those individuals that have that particular heritable adaptive trait higher fitness to both survive and then later reproduce, giving those individuals a differential survival in between, so amongst other individuals within that same population. And those individuals would leave more of that particular adaptive trait in future generations of that population. In your textbook, you have this particular chart of the concepts of behind natural selection. So as Darwin and actually also Wallace and Malthus shaped during the 19th century, people studied or noticed heredity for a very long time. They didn't necessarily call it genetics. And even though Mendel overlaps in time with Darwin, and he's, so Mendel, the father of genetics, a Czech monk that has a brilliant mathematical logic behind his scientific designs on peas. So even though Mendel came up with the idea of hereditary factors, which now today we call genes, and he sends his years of inferences and conclusions of his studies on peas to Darwin. Unfortunately, it's very late in Darwin's life. He's not feeling very good, and he never opened the article that Mendel sent to him. So even our understanding of heredity has evolved or transformed and improved, we think, through human history. So Mendel noticed that different so-called, he called them hereditary factors in different individuals would give an alternate trait or alternate characteristics of blue eyes, brown eyes, or in case of peas, white flowers versus purple flowers, or yellow seeds versus green seeds, and so on. And then later on, in the early 20th century, Morgan, an American zoologist, studied, he wanted to test the theories behind Mendelian genetics or theory of heredity in Drosophila, or the fruit flies, and he noticed the idea of mutation and chromosomes and crossing over and so on. So today we know, as a summary of the principles of natural selection, that individuals that have an adaptive trait that could have been acquired through a mutation, and it's related to the environment at the time, so that's why we call it relative fitness to the environment that that population is in that particular time, will lead to increase in the numbers of that particular allele in future generations, which leads us to our next topic, lesson of microevolution. But before, let's go through this very interesting chronological chart referring to our understanding of evolution through time. So it's split in separate areas of our understanding of evolution. So we can look at the Earth's history right here, and then life history or naturalists, so geology and naturalists or biology, and then a mechanism of evolution, which is what we're trying to understand right now, or the understanding of heredity, or how the genetics evolved from Mendel and Morgan and the discovery of DNA and so on. So there was not much thought about geology before 1700 or 18th century and so on, but people did notice that organisms were different but not extremely different, so comparative anatomy and morphology was already incipient. And of course people observed, right? So they noticed ideas of heredity, they noticed ideas of evolution, and they noticed ideas of life history and earth history. And they already discovered fossils that represented either impressions or skeletons of organisms that did not exist anymore. And soon enough, they were able to put together this idea of nested hierarchies from comparative anatomy and fossils. So people would be able to tell that there are vertebrates and invertebrates. And within the group of vertebrates, they could be fish with no limbs, but they could be four-legged animals and so on. And then within the four-legged animals, there could be birds versus mammals and so on. So all of these are considered nested or developed nested hierarchies, like this particular phylogenetic tree of birds that have evolved from or adapted from a bird with a beak that could have been used for a multitude of feeding to this particular much thicker beak, similar to the beak in a cardinal in North America, for example, that is adapted to crack seeds. So people even notice the ecology of humans or how humans interact with their environment and so on. And very early on in 19th century, people came up with ideas of evolution and how species have transformed. And we know that Lyell came up with the idea of stratification, or different strata of rocks at different levels of depth within the crust of Earth. Also, Charles Lyell came up with the idea of uniformitarianism, referring to the same physical forces that shape Earth today have probably shaped Earth through its own history of 4+ billion years now. So Mendel discovers the idea of genes and discrete genes. That means that you can inherit either green seeds versus yellow seeds. But when offsprings of these individuals are bred, so the offsprings of peas with green seeds versus yellow seeds, when they are bred, they will only express one or the other. Instead of being like two pieces of glass, so you have yellow and green together and you can see blue or some other combination of those two colors, you actually see only one. That's why they're called discrete, later labeled genes. And then when offsprings of the second generation of those individuals will breed, then you can see again occasionally expression of green seeds versus the yellow seeds and so on. So concept of natural selection, as we just discussed, is shaping up. The idea of biogeography, it's already very clearly observed by Wallace and multitude of other naturalists that are exploring the Earth into discovering different organisms that they have not seen before because they're adapted to different climates on different continents. So by 1900, so by early 20th century, so at the border between 19th and 20th century, people already start thinking about how are we connected to all this, what exactly is our connection with the rest of life on Earth, or more exactly, human evolution. As I said, early 19th or 20th century, 1900s, the concepts of chromosomes. So Mendel was incredibly lucky, let's say, that he chose 7 characteristics that were on the 7 different pairs of chromosomes in peas But Morgan, the zoologist and then geneticist that tried to test this in fruit flies, had problems, and he actually noticed that sometimes the so-called discrete genes can be transferred together, and that depends on how close they are arranged on the same chromosome. So that describes the concept of linkage. Or occasionally those chromosomes can cross over and split and break and recombine, and that could lead to mutation or change. So in the 20th century, genetics exploded. So finally, by the middle of the century, DNA was clear that is carrying the genetic information. And then later on, the shape of the DNA was discovered and clearly explained. And now we have abilities way beyond the thought of the people that have discovered all that. Also in the 20th century, people figured out how to age fossils through processes such as radiometric dating. So I would like you to make sure you take a look in your textbook to this idea of radiometric dating and how does it work? What is carbon-14 or carbon dating, and how useful is that to fossils of millions of years old? Can we use carbon dating to fossils that are over 60,000 years old? And if we cannot, how can we tell how old the fossil is? So please refer to a textbook referring that. Soon, sometime middle 20th century, we got this idea of endosymbiosis, which refers to the fact that mitochondria and chloroplasts have evolved as endosymbionts. So they were probably separate entities. They were organisms, unicellular, bacterial type, prokaryotic type of organisms that have been engulfed by another larger similar organism for food. And it turned out that they were too large, or for whatever reason they were able to survive and became endosymbionts, so living together inside of this larger cell. And today, all eukaryotes carry mitochondria, which have their own DNA that is more similar to bacteria, and mitochondria divide independently from the genes in the nucleus at a total different time during the cell cycle, and so on. And a very similar secondary event of endosymbiosis occurred when such an organism engulfed a chloroplast. And a chloroplast was an independent photosynthetic bacterium, similar to today's, let's say, blue-green so-called algae. Blue-green algae that now we know that are actually cyanobacteria, or bacteria that are blue or blue-green.